Jen woke up suddenly. He slowly tried to open his eyes, but he couldn't because the light was burning his retinas. He felt nauseous and needed to get up and take a breath of fresh air, but hands kept holding him down. He tried to speak, but realized there was something in his throat preventing him from uttering any words. He then tried to remove it, but in the process, with disgust, he noticed that he only had one arm, while the other remained blocked by the hands. He couldn't see anything, couldn't speak, and couldn't move. He heard some voices, but couldn't interpret what they were saying. He was able to reason, but only at a basic level, limited to wondering where he was and what was happening. Slowly, he began to come to himself. He began to wonder who was speaking around him. He heard two female voices and one male voice, but he couldn't recognize them. Tired of the unclear situation, he tried to get up with more force, and this time they couldn't hold him down. He sat up, but soon an excruciating pain that came from his ribs forced him to lie down again. He realized he was on a bed. The male voice suddenly changed tone, while the female voices stopped talking. It seemed like he was trying to tell him something, but he couldn't make sense of his words. "Stay calm, Mr. Hoffman," the male voice said. He began to understand what was being said to him. He was slowly recovering. "Open your eyes," he continued. He obeyed somewhat timidly, but realized that this time the light didn't burn his eyes so much as to prevent him from opening them. He still couldn't focus, had a blurred image of where he was. He realized, however, that he was in a closed room and had confirmation that there were 3 individuals around him. A few seconds later, the figure that appeared to be a male approached a few centimeters away from his head and began to illuminate his eyes with a small light. Jen didn't appreciate the gesture, as he felt a burning sensation in his retinas again, so he rebelled calmly, in vain, but shortly after he finally managed to focus and think. He finally realized he was in a hospital room and that his sisters, Jennifer and Jane, were with him along with the doctor. Now that he had his brain back, he was able to remember what had happened before he fainted and deduced that he probably had gone into a coma. His condition must have been quite serious considering the expressions on the faces of the 2 girls and the fact that it was necessary to implant a tube in his esophagus to allow him to breathe.
Blink once to say yes, twice to say no,
the doctor said. It was the usual procedure he had done numerous times, except this time, he wasn't the doctor.
Your name is Jen Hoffman.
He blinked once.
Do you work in the Central Security System as a high-level member in the Others Macro section?
He blinked once again.
Are you the son of John and Jessica Hoffman?
He blinked once one more time.
Good, his memory seems intact. Now answer the following question. How many fingers did I raise?
The doctor raised 3 fingers and Jen blinked 3 times.
Very good. Now I need to check that all parts of your body are still sensitive.
The doctor began poking his arm with the pen he had in his hand.
Did you feel anything?
Jen blinked once. Then the doctor started poking his legs.
What about now?
This time, after a moment of hesitation, Jen blinked twice. The doctor repeated the process, but nothing happened. An expression of dismay covered first Jen's face and then his sister's.
Don't worry, you haven't necessarily lost the use of your legs. They can be recovered through physiotherapy. I inform you that you've been in a coma for 5 days. This was caused by very serious injuries inflicted during a fight, during the operations. You also stopped breathing, so it was necessary to intubate you. However, in a couple of hours, your body should be able to breathe on its own again. I believe that for your complete recovery, you only need to wait a month, considering your anomalous physique. A man with a normal physique would not have survived a tenth of the injuries you suffered. And considering that you do not have particular regenerative abilities, this is truly impressive. As soon as you have recovered enough, we will start the operation to reimplant a new arm and foot. Your condition is stable, and I am aware that you have experience in the medical field, which is why I believe it is safe for you to have some privacy with your sisters. I think you have a lot to say to each other. If necessary, use one of the buttons near your bed to call a member of the medical staff.
The doctor seemed extremely courteous, perhaps intimidated by Jen's high rank. He then left the room without anyone saying anything. A sudden silence fell in the room. interrupted only by the beeps of the monitor reporting the electrocardiogram and by Jen's slow and labored breathing. Outside, it was evening, but the sun's rays seemed not to enter through the window. The room was illuminated only by artificial light. What should be said in these situations? It was not the first time that their brother had risked his life, but they had never seen him in this state before. He was a man of great dignity, who always walked with his head held high, so it was difficult for the two Hoffman sisters to see him reduced to an almost pathetic state, with tubes coming out of his body from all sides. Both, in different ways, felt affection for him. However, this emotion was considered a manifestation of weakness within the city's mentality and, as such, had to be repressed. But now both didn't care about appearing strong or not. They were damn scared. They had feared losing perhaps one of the most important persons in their lives. Not even the cruelest of worlds can cancel out the love of a united family. Both of them approached him. Jennifer was on the right side of Jane on the left. Jennifer placed a hand on her brother's body and began to cry and sob slowly, wetting her face. The eldest Hoffman then started to gently caress her face with his only remaining arm. In the end, the two couldn't help but hug each other. Jane watched the scene, and in the end, she also decided to embrace her brother. They stayed in this position for about a minute. Then Jem was forced to push them both away due to the excruciating pain in his ribs that they were involuntarily crushing. While Jennifer wiped away her tears with her shirt, Jen pointed to his black eye, which was still in the healing phase, and asked what had happened. The girl remained silent, stunned, remembering the unpleasant episode of a few days before. Then Jane answered for her.
The gym teacher beat her up because she used her powers at school, destroying the gym.
Jennifer didn't like this answer at all.
Mind your own business. You just told the part of the story that made me look the worst, right? Jen, I'm sorry. I know I shouldn't use my powers like this, but all my classmates were making fun of me. I couldn't stand it anymore. I'm not saying I didn't make a mistake, but I'm not as stupid as Jane says I am.
Do you think I never get angry? Yet, I always use my powers with moderation.
Jane replied, also a medium-level Esper, who already worked in her macro session, as could be deduced from the green band she proudly wore on her arm. She continued,
Why don't you admit when you're wrong without compromise once in a while?
Are you deaf or something? I admitted I was wrong, but you wanted me to look like an idiot, so I had to defend myself.
What are you talking about? I just told him what happened. But everything seems to bother you anyway.
You're so annoying. Jen, get well soon. I don't want to spend even a second with her anymore. This witch wants me to do everything she says.
The city's authorities, seeing the condition of our protagonist, entrusted Jennifer, being a minor, against her will, under Jane's custody. The paradox was that Jennifer was perfectly used to staying alone at home, since Jen often went on external missions outside the walls that lasted for days.
Why don't you listen to me once in a while?
Jane said.
Maybe you'd avoid doing stupidities.
Now you're making me.
But Jennifer didn't have time to finish the sentence because she was suddenly interrupted by Jen, who managed to silence them both simply by sitting up. He then tried to remove the tube from his esophagus. The two girls, perplexed and worried, wondered if it was a wise choice. After successfully completing the operation, he began to breathe heavily, experiencing considerable pain in his ribs. Finally, as his sisters looked at him in shock, he managed to say, in a very weak and low voice,
Can't you two stop fighting for once?
This made them feel a slight sense of shame, but both continued to think they were right. Jen continued to breathe heavily, while touching the part where his arm had been amputated with the finger of his other hand. This reminded him of the pain he had felt in the fight with the shape-shifting queen. He felt humiliated and tormented by guilt. In short, his mood was in the dumps. He had to talk to Sean. The boy had revealed himself to be a powerful Esper, perhaps one of the strongest he had ever seen. He had eliminated his opponent, which had almost cost him his life, without even struggling. Considering that he had had many previous experiences with Espers in his life, He estimated that the boy could easily be at the master level. However, he knew that he would not have an easy life if his powers were known in the city, as he would be immediately taken away from his family and the other members of the master level. Esper Macro Section would try to hinder him in every way possible, considering their selfishness and erratic behavior. No, it was better that he himself explained how to best manage his powers. In the end, Espers naturally learned to use their powers once acquired, so they did not need proper training. That's why he attributed the credit for the victory in the fight to himself, and the news that there was a new powerful psychic in the city should not leak out. He just hoped that Sean was smart enough to understand that he had to remain silent, which he modestly doubted. So, he stayed to think about what to do, but maybe now was not the right time to do so. His sisters were traumatized. They had been afraid of losing him. He couldn't show himself cold or indifferent to them, and he didn't want Jennifer to find out that he and Sean were seeing each other. So, he broke the small silence that had fallen in the room and asked, in a weak and feeble voice,
What have I missed in these 5 days?
Not much, to be honest.
Jane replied.
The only interesting thing was what happened to Jennifer.
Then Jan said,
Why are you here? I don't believe that those idiots of your superiors gave you some days off.
Actually, they did.
Really? How did you do it?
I didn't do anything. I just asked some days to the high-level espers, but they said no. It was a master-level esper who finally granted them to me.
Really? Who?
Jen asked, surprised.
Minori Tomizawa.
Really? Wow, that woman really cares about me then.
Jennifer suddenly interrupted the conversation between the two.
They suspended me for 7 days instead. Well, at least I got some rest.
She said in an almost annoyed tone, trying to find something positive in something that had nothing positive about it.
Oh, right.
Jen said, trying to show compassion towards her.
And how that turned up?
I talked to the principal myself, given your absence.
Jane said.
And he told me that there would be no further disciplinary action.
So, all in all, you got off easy.
Jen replied, trying to lift her spirits.
Easy my ass.
Jennifer replied, almost yelling, as her face changed expression.
It was the worst day of my life. That bitch of a gym teacher hit and humiliated me. I could have used my powers on her, and she wouldn't have been able to react in any way, but if I had done it, I would have ruined my life. But it's already ruined now that I think about it.
You're always so dramatic.
Jane said, almost annoyed.
You always act like a victim.
But Jennifer, upon hearing such a response, became furious.
Again. Can you at least try to mind your own business? You're just an ugly witch.
I can't stay silent while you only think of yourself in a situation like this.
I can't stand you anymore. I'm not coming back to your house today.
You know it's not possible. I don't want you at my house either, but in life, you have to accept compromises, something you've never learned to do.
Who do you think you are to teach me things?
And who do you think you are to always demand to be the center of attention?
But Jen, tired of the yelling, interrupted the argument by exclaiming,
You're both such a fucking pain in the ass. Get out of my room.
The two girls remained silent, watching their brother, surprised by his sudden aggressiveness. Their frequent arguments were one of the things Jen hated the most.
I'm not kidding, go away. You don't even have the decency to stop fighting when I'm dying. I refuse to spend any more time with you if you keep screaming like two chickens.
Can I stay with you?
Jennifer asked.
Have you already forgotten about the night curfew? You'd better hurry before the sun sets.
All three Hoffmans looked out the window at the sky.
You're right.
Jane said.
We'd better hurry, or we risk not making it back in time.
In the end, the three were forced to part ways. Jennifer initially had no intention of spending just one more day with her sister, but she was eventually persuaded by the other two to come back. The Hoffmans said their goodbyes, while Jennifer promised Jen that she would return the next day. 10 minutes later, Jen decided that it was better to not waste any more time and wanted to immediately resolve the problem with Sean. He pressed the button that the doctor had previously indicated to call a nurse to his room. One arrived shortly after, a young woman, probably just finished with her general education, with brown hair and delicate facial features.
What's the problem?
She asked. Jen was a bit enchanted by her beauty. He expected an older nurse, the ones his luck usually reserved for him. In a few moments, his head was filled with erotic thoughts with the nurse as the protagonist. After all, he had not had sexual intercourse since his wife had died, as it was forbidden to have sex with anyone other than one's spouse. But he didn't have time to indulge in such a stupid way.
During the accident, there was a boy with red hair with me. How is he doing?
His tone of voice was becoming less weak and his breathing less labored.
Mr. Hoffman, that button should only be pressed if there is an urgency, not for this kind of matter, and weren't you intubated?
Answer the question.
Jen said in an authoritative tone.
I remember that you came here with the boy some days ago. You had emergency surgery, but he was healthy, he just seemed scared.
It's not possible.
Jen replied confidently.
He had a broken leg, it's not him.
Sir, as far as I know, he's the only boy with red hair who came here this week. Are you sure he broke his leg? Your memory might be confused.
Jen was sure that his memory was intact, his memories were too vivid. He then remembered that Sean's leg, although he hadn't noticed it, had suddenly healed while he was fighting the Queen. This led him to realize an astounding conclusion. He quickly deduced that Sean had managed to develop a superhuman regenerative ability, which had allowed him to heal his broken leg in a very short time. What the hell did that mean? Espers couldn't develop physical powers, including regeneration. It was not possible to have two IDUS genetic mutations. He couldn't allow the young mind of such a powerful psychic to fall into the wrong hands. He was even more determined to resolve the issue.
Maybe you're right.
Jen said then.
What happened to the healthy boy who came with me?
I think he stayed in the hospital for a few hours and then left.
Is that all? What else do you know?
I don't know anything, Mr. Hoffman. I'm just a nurse.
She said, annoyed. Jen sighed loudly, but eventually gave up.
Okay, you can go. I don't need your help.
Don't use the button for reasons that don't concern your health next time.
Yes, yes, yes. Now go away.
The nurse, a little intimidated and annoyed by Jen's bad temper, obeyed in silence. Our protagonist realized that he would not get anything by questioning those poor nurses. He had to speak directly to the doctor who had taken care of him, or even better, to the hospital director, whom he knew personally, since he had been his employee. However, it was now night and the night curfew ensured that only a few doctors were authorized to remain working in the hospital. He decided it would be better to postpone his problems until the next morning. A few hours later, the lights in his room were turned off for the night, and he was left alone in the dark. He could only see the monitor of the electrocardiogram, which also emitted that annoying beep. He began to get bored, staring at the ceiling in the hope of falling asleep, but he couldn't do it, which was very unusual for a narcoleptic like him. He needed to find something to do. There were some papers and a pen next to him. He decided he would pass the time by continuing his list of happiness. However, there was a small problem. It was too dark to write. He had a flashlight in his jacket, but all his clothing had been sent somewhere and he was only wearing that classic hospital gown that patients wear. So he tried to strain his eyes to see something, making a huge effort that almost made his eyes melt. It would be a hassle, but better than doing nothing. So, he began to reflect on it a bit, then brought the pen to the paper and began to write. Number 3. When you realize that life has no rational sense, you realize that it's up to you to decide what is important or not. The main problem of human existence is that it is mostly composed of relative values, established by certain points of view and perspectives. While almost none are absolute or indisputable, the absence of true indisputable points generates chaos in the human mind that drives it to force the creation of false absolute values of an artificial nature. This is how religions, ideologies, and simple ideas are born. He had other thoughts in his head, but he was starting to feel sleepy. He decided to take advantage of the moment to get some good rest. He really needed to relax. After all, he had just risked his life. He deserved a moment of peace. He continued to stare at the ceiling and slowly sleep took over. The next morning, he was woken up by the brunette nurse from the previous evening. He didn't like it, and certainly didn't hide it. However, he had been woken up because some visitors had urgently come to see him. He thought they were his sisters, but he didn't understand what they had to tell him so urgently early in the morning. He asked who they were, and from the answer, he understood that it was Sean, accompanied by a man, presumably his father. He couldn't get up, his legs were still numb, so they had to come to him. He told the nurse, who was now treated like a slave, to let them in. Shortly after, the father opened the door abruptly, in a way that made it clear he was angry, and the two entered his room. Sean had the usual apathetic expression on his face, but he seemed fine. The father, Mr. Peterson, on the other hand, had a severe and authoritative air. Who knows what he wanted to say? He was a man in his 50s, with brown eyes and partially bald, completely clean-shaven. He was dressed all in black, with a jacket over the typical dark blue shirt with a white collar. He looked more like an undertaker than a school principal. The man positioned himself exactly in front of Jen's feet, at a distance of about a meter from him, while continuing to hold one hand on his son's shoulder, almost as if to claim ownership. He stared at our protagonist in the eyes, keeping his own almost wide open, in an air of disapproval and reproach. Usually, this attitude instills a certain fear, making him appear much more powerful and dangerous than he truthfully was. The problem is that outside of school, especially with superhumans, this technique didn't work, but he didn't seem to understand. He continued to stare at him in the eyes until Jen himself, dismayed by the fact that the man didn't say a word, broke the silence.
"So, what did you come here for?"
asked the superhuman with a perplexed tone of voice. The man let out a deep sigh, emanating an air of impatience, almost as if he expected Jen to already know what he wanted. After another 3 or 4 seconds of silence, the man finally decided to respond.
"What do you think I came here for, Dr. Hoffman? Obviously. I want clarifications and explanations,"
said Mr. Peterson with a low, almost smoker's voice. It was the voice of an old man, with a soul deeply anchored to the system and authority. Jen hated the latter, and that man was the two-legged representation of the rigidity of the city. He couldn't help but provoke him a little.
"Clarifications about what? I don't understand,"
said Jen with a silly look. Then the man, who understood the provocation perfectly, even more impatient, began to raise his voice.
"About my son. Obviously. I'll ask you directly. So you cannot beat around the bush. What was my son doing with you?"
"Nothing, we met by chance."
Then the man, even more agitated, approached Jen's bed, resting both hands on the bed.
"You are a liar. The authorities have informed me that the cameras show that you two meet very often."
"And what if they are lying to you?"
said Jen sarcastically.
"Nonsense. Listen carefully. I heard that you, despite spending time with my son without my knowledge, were also able to save his life. I am willing to turn a blind eye to the matter if you promise not to see my son anymore. You have a bad reputation, and I do not want you to transmit this bad behavior to my son."
Jen started to get serious.
"Hey, listen, idiot. First of all, take your fucking hands off my bed."
Mr. Peterson, clearly surprised and intimidated by this sudden change of attitude, almost submissively obeyed such an order. "Before you accuse him of being a coward, let me explain the situation better. Jen is almost 2 meters tall, physically robust, with superhuman strength and a bad reputation."
"Listen,"
Jen continued.
"I don't know who's the idiot who talked about my business, but I think he left out an important detail. It was your son who came to me. And he was really good at it. He convinced me to help him in his boring life."
"What? Is what he says true, Sean?"
Sean nodded in agreement. At this point, the man, confused, remained silent for a few seconds, but did not abandon his position.
"It doesn't matter. He's just a boy. You're the adult. You should have told him no. Or you should have contacted me."
"You're a terrible father, control freak,"
said Jen, with a more serious tone.
"How dare."
"You're also insecure, incapable of managing your own emotions, and try to balance this insecurity by controlling everything you consider yours, including your son. The point is that your son is a human being, not a lamp on a bedside table, and he needs emotional support to bring out his personality and become a healthy adult. I believe your son simply found something in me that you were not able to give him, and if he found it in someone like me, it means that you are truly a disaster as a father.
Mr. Peterson's pride was starting to hurt. When he had entered the room, he imagined he could have done whatever he wanted to Jen, but the man he was dealing with was incapable of feeling shame, and didn't seem to be even slightly intimidated by his presence, or by the fact that he could simply report him for spending time with a minor without the parents' permission, getting him into trouble. Perhaps the latter strategy was the one to adopt. Continuing this discussion had proven too difficult and useless.
You. How? You don't even have a shred of dignity. Do you? You know I can report you. Right. I'll do it if you keep responding like this.
But he was too defensive to be taken seriously. He was too doubtful. Was it really a good move to report him? If he were promoted to master, his political influence would increase exponentially, enough to harm him later on. Even with a successful report, he wouldn't be punished enough to damage his career. Perhaps it wasn't a good idea. Moreover, was it really a wise choice to become an enemy of a superhuman, one of those considered untouchable in the city? Jen, as a good predator, began to sniff out his opponent's weakness, and decided to make his move, like a cold chess player.
You're threatening me. How boring. You don't know how many people threaten me for one reason or another every day, and yet I'm still here. Step aside, old man, and let me take care of Sean.
Mr. Peterson's spirit began to waver. Jen was taking something from him, namely his son's esteem, and he couldn't do anything about it. He was clearly in trouble now. He tried one last desperate move.
You know what? I am going through with this. No matter the costs. First, I'll report you. I don't care about the consequences. Then, I'll make your sister pay as well. She comes to my school. I can do whatever I want with her. I can even fail her and send her to a recruitment camp.
Of course, he didn't really intend to do it. His goal was to hurt Jen somehow as he had been able to hurt him. But Jen remained impassive and replied, with a voice that had now fully recovered.
If you do that, you'll create a mess that you won't be able to handle.
At this point Sean, who had been listening to the two the whole time, decided to interrupt his silence and said,
Father, Mr. Hoffman is right.
Checkmate. With these words, pronounced directly by his son, Mr. Peterson had completely consumed his desire to fight. His spirit was shattered, his morale crushed. His son had just rebelled against his power. He had never gone against his will before, but the only time he did, it was damn effective. Perhaps Jen's influence was beginning to be felt. His father, now disappointed, frustrated, and embittered, felt tremendously hurt. He uttered a simple and weak,
Well?
and left the room without saying anything else, leaving Sean and Hoffman alone.
He'll be okay, don't worry.
Mr. Hoffman, did I do the right thing?
Asked Sean.
I can't answer to that question, Sean.
They remained silent for a moment. Sean, while looking out the window, reflected on his actions, and wondered if it was correct to respond to his father in that way and what the consequences would be. Shortly after, he turned and looked at his master, who had a pleased smile on his face. He was only smiling on one side of his face, while continuing to stare at Sean with eyes full of satisfaction and energy. He could easily be mistaken for a maniac.
You didn't tell anyone about your powers, did you?
Jen asked quickly, keeping a smile on his face, convinced that the answer would be negative.
No, I told nobody about them.
Sean replied. Jen let out a small laugh. He didn't expect his silence.
And how did you know that I didn't want you to say anything?
Oh, I understood that when I found out that you took credit for killing the creature. Did I do something wrong?
Jen let out a second, more visible laugh.
You're amazing. You were quite clever. How can you be so damn brilliant sometimes and then so damn naive at others?
I don't know, Mr. Hoffman.
Stop calling me like that. Now we need to talk seriously. Answer this question, what do you know about the Espers?
Almost nothing.
Perfect, now I have to explain everything to you. The Espers, also known as psychics, are incredibly powerful humans. They are endowed with powers of incredible destructive capacity, so much so that their macro section is by far the most feared in the city. Some of them are so powerful that if they decided to fight alone against the rest of humanity, they would win without even using their maximum potential. The nature of their powers is telekinetic. They can lift any object small enough to be lifted by their power from a distance with the strength of their mind. Weaker espers can only lift a small vehicle, but the most powerful can move entire regions of land. Many of them also possess other psychic abilities, such as pyromania, the ability to control the weather or to control electricity. One peculiarity of psychics is that, over the course of their lives, they cannot increase or decrease their psychic power, it remains the same until they suffer brain damage or until they die. Many of them are lunatics. I have met many of them in my life, and I can assure you that most of them are a mass of hysterical megalomaniacs who do not accept any disrespect towards them and handle their power in the worst possible way, while isolating themselves from the rest of society. They are also able to lift people, even themselves, which is why many of them can fly, but it is more tiring for them because all men are endowed with a characteristic called psychic resistance. In practice, it is the ability of an individual's mind to resist psychic attacks directed towards him. Although everyone possesses it, that of the espers is generally hundreds of times higher than that of a normal person. Some are born with high psychic resistance but are not endowed with other psychic powers. I am one of them, and fortunately, I would add, only thanks to it have I been able to prevail over some espers who attacked me for no reason, well, maybe not entirely without reason. Anyway, I'm tired of explaining to you what you are. I have to tell you why you have to avoid anyone finding out about your powers. If that were to happen, you would be immediately expelled from school and put in the macro section. Unlike my sister, you are an incredibly powerful esper, so they won't let you finish school. Probably, given your age, they would classify you as high level, although your abilities can easily be considered master level. The problem is that once inside, no one would help you, and, in fact, you would be hindered in every way. In the long run, I can assure you that you will end up going crazy and, to resolve conflicts, you will start using your powers instead of common sense, becoming another lunatic and unhappy esper. Also, your apathy could intensify. Even though usually espers are hyper-emotional, you are not the only case of apathetic psychic. I don't want you to become like them. Trust me, do what I say, and once you are able to face the difficulties you will encounter within the esper macro section, we will tell everyone about your abilities.
Sean thought for a moment about what to do but not too long, and then agreed to his master's plan.
All right.
Oh, by the way. In case the authorities discover that we're hiding your powers, you should be able to handle it without too many problems, but I would be in trouble, so, don't fuck up, okay?
Yes. I have to go now. I need to talk to my dad.
Okay. We have to see each other again, but I'd say let's wait at least a month to calm things down, given what happened. I have to solve quite a few problems, and I need time. The central security system will ask questions about the dynamics of what just happened, and they won't take long to realize that something is wrong, given the peculiar way you killed that being. I have to find an alibi that holds up, and besides, I have to recover. It's better if we don't see each other for a while.
But as Sean reached the threshold of the door, Jen remembered something he had to tell him.
Wait. Before you go, I want to make one thing clear, I'm not a moralist, nor am I an idealist. The only reason I'm helping you is that I don't want to see you ruined by those dogs. Don't expect to change the current political situation with your powers.
Sean remained silent for a moment. Then, plagued by doubts, he had to ask his master.
Do you think what we're doing is right?
Right. Sean, what is justice? Do you think there is an absolute justice that is the same for everyone, or is it only relative to individual points of view? Sean, justice does not exist. Good and evil are concepts created by men to simplify an infinite universe that he is not able to understand. What I'm doing is not justice, it's compassion. What you are doing can be summed up in one word, trust, which for some reason you have in me.
This triggered a series of thoughts and questions in Sean's head that had to be re-elaborated by the boy. In fact, he remained staring at the floor, looking thoughtful, and shortly after he left the room. After an intense awakening, Jen lay on his side and closed his eyes, trying to go back to sleep. He hated being woken up. He knew that if he didn't fall asleep again, he wouldn't have a good day. Unfortunately for him, a few minutes later someone else entered his room. Who's annoying me now, he thought. He turned to the other side to see who it was, and in front of him, he found Jennifer, who looked annoyed and a bit confused, asking,
What the heck is Sean doing in this hospital?
And Jen was forced to tell another series of lies to cover up the fact that he knew him, thus definitively marking the impossibility of having a good sleep.